The billionaire who married his business partner, only to discover she'd been hiding a letter all along. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support truly means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The rain over San Francisco that night was not just weather, it was an omen. From the top floor of Mercer Tower, Elias Mercer stood against the glass wall, watching lightning trace silver veins across the sky. At 39, he was the kind of man who built skylines. His company had turned empty lots into monuments of glass and steel. People called him the architect of tomorrow. But behind every title, there is a silence, and Elias's silence was deafening. He had everything that success could buy, except peace. On his desk lay two documents, a lawsuit that threatened to strip him of his empire, and a marriage contract that could save it. He hated both. But time was running out, and the board demanded he marry before the next quarter's vote to secure the family's legacy clause. They needed an image stability, humanity, a partner who would soften his reputation. He needed someone who could match him in intellect, yet stay untouched by his world's corruption. That is when the name appeared on his assistant's tablet, Dr. Clara Nguyen, 32 years old, sustainable design architect, half Vietnamese, half American, raised in Seattle, known for her community housing projects that put people before profit. Her eyes in the photo were calm, almost defiant, the kind of calm that storms fear. She was everything his circle of investors would call unsuitable, and maybe that was why she felt right. Elias remembered meeting her 6 months earlier at a design summit. She had challenged him on stage in front of 200 executives. He had proposed building luxury condos near a historic district. She called it a monument to amnesia. Her words had cut him then, but now they echoed like truth. The same woman who once questioned his vision might now be his only chance to rebuild it. At midnight, he dialed her number. It rang 4 times before she answered. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the rustle of blueprints in the background. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I did not expect your call." Elias paused, choosing his words carefully. "Clara, this will sound absurd, but I need your help, and it involves marriage." There was a silence, long enough for thunder to fill it. Then she said softly, "Marriage or business?" He exhaled. "Both, apparently. My company's board requires an image of stability, and I need someone real. Someone the press will believe." "And what do I get in return?" she asked. Elias turned to the window. The city lights trembled in the rain. "You get funding for your community complex on the South Wharf, the one your proposal board keeps rejecting. Full creative control." Another pause. Then, quietly, "You are asking me to fake a life with you?" "Yes," he said. "For 6 months. We both get what we need." Clara's laugh was low, almost sad. "And when the 6 months are over, then we walk away. Clean." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she whispered something almost to herself. "Every structure starts with a crack, and then, send me the terms, Mr. Mercer. I will read them." When the call ended, Elias stared at his reflection in the glass. The rain distorted his face, breaking it into fragments. For the first time in years, he did not see the man who won. He saw a man about to wager his soul. Across the city, in a small apartment filled with sketches and the faint smell of cedar, Clara set her phone down beside an envelope, an old letter addressed in fading ink. The name on it read, "To my daughter, for the day she forgets what love should look like." She touched it gently, then tucked it back into her journal. She would read it later. For now, she had just agreed to marry a billionaire she did not trust. And somehow, that felt like the most honest decision she had made in years. The next morning, the storm had cleared, leaving San Francisco washed clean and shining. Elias Mercer arrived at his office earlier than usual. The marble floors of Mercer Tower reflected the pale light of dawn, and the air smelled faintly of rain and coffee. His assistant had already placed a folder on his desk, labeled in sharp black letters, "Marriage Agreement, Confidential." He stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the cool surface of the desk. It felt absurd, almost theatrical. A man who could sign off on billion-dollar projects now hesitated over 4 pieces of paper. But this, he told himself, was not about love. It was about survival. It was about saving what hundreds of people depended on. He signed the first page. The pen's weight felt heavier than usual. Across town, Clara Nguyen walked through the narrow streets near her studio, the sound of her boots echoing against wet pavement. She stopped at a small corner cafe where the barista already knew her order: black coffee, no sugar, a habit she had learned from her late father. The envelope with the contract lay inside her bag, next to her sketchbook and the old letter she still had not opened. She thought about the call again, about his voice, steady, confident, and strangely tired. She did not know Elias Mercer well, but she knew of him. Everyone in the architectural world did. He was brilliant, ambitious, and sometimes ruthless. A man who built towers that seemed to challenge the sky itself. The idea of standing next to someone like him, even for show, felt unreal. But the thought of her own unfinished project, the community complex that would give low-income families a home with dignity, was enough to silence her doubts. She took a slow breath, pulled out her pen, and signed her name at the bottom of the agreement. By noon, their signatures met on the same line, and everything changed. The ceremony was arranged quietly, without media or family. Only 2 witnesses, a city clerk, and the scent of rain still clinging to the air. It was held in a glass conservatory overlooking the bay. The sky was pale blue, the kind of fragile color that appears after a storm. Elias wore a dark suit, simple yet precise. Clara wore an ivory dress made of linen and silk, something she had sewn herself over a single weekend. No photographers, no orchestra, no champagne. Just the sound of waves and the echo of their own footsteps on the stone floor. When the clerk asked them to exchange vows, Elias looked at her not as an investor or as a savior, but as a woman standing in equal light. He said quietly, "This is not about promises, it is about purpose." She nodded once. "Then, let us build something that will not collapse." The witnesses signed. The clerk smiled politely and wished them luck. And just like that, the contract was sealed, legal, and binding. They walked out together into the sunlight. The air smelled of salt and eucalyptus. For a moment, they stood side by side, unsure what to say. It was Elias who broke the silence. "You will move into the penthouse tomorrow. It is closer to the office, and safer from reporters." Clara looked at him. "Is that an order or an offer?" He almost smiled. "A practical suggestion," she answered with a small shrug. "Practicality seems to be our theme." Inside the car, the driver opened the door, but she paused before getting in. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon, where cranes moved like slow, patient birds above the city. "Why did you choose me?" she asked. Elias turned to her, surprised by the directness. "Because you are not afraid to tell me when I am wrong," he said. "And because people believe in you. I need that." She looked down at her hands, the ring simple and silver, resting awkwardly against her skin. "Belief is fragile, Mr. Mercer. Handle it like glass." Heh. That night, back at Mercer Tower, Elias stood again before the same window where he had watched the storm. Below, the city pulsed with light. He touched the ring on his finger and wondered when business had begun to feel so personal. Across the city, in her small apartment, Clara packed her sketchbooks and a few framed photos of her parents. On her work table, she left behind a single drawing, an unfinished design of a bridge connecting 2 separate islands. She had titled it, "The Distance Between Us." When she turned off the light, she caught her reflection in the window. For the first time, she felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. Tomorrow, she would step into a world of marble floors, quiet servants, and endless meetings. A world that was not hers. Yet deep inside, a voice whispered that maybe she was not there to fit in, but to change something. In another part of the city, Elias poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat in the dark. He tried to read the headlines on his phone but lost interest. His mind kept replaying the sound of her voice, saying, "Then let us build something that will not collapse." It echoed like an architectural truth, and maybe like a warning. Outside, the bay lights shimmered. 2 strangers now shared a contract, a name, and a silence thick enough to build a story on. Neither of them knew it yet, but the foundation they had just laid would hold far more than a business arrangement. It would soon hold their hearts. By the following evening, Clara Nguyen stood in front of the elevator doors that led to the top floor of Mercer Tower. The building shimmered against the dusk sky, its mirrored glass reflecting the last traces of sunlight. She held 1 suitcase in each hand, a modest amount of belongings for someone about to step into the world of a billionaire. The security guard greeted her politely and pressed the elevator button. The ride was silent except for the low hum of the motor. When the doors opened, a burst of warm light and the faint scent of cedar filled the air. The penthouse stretched wide, with tall windows offering a panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay. It was beautiful, yes, but sterile, too perfect, almost like a museum. Elias Mercer stood near the window, his reflection blending into the night outside. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "You made it," he said simply. "I did," she replied, her tone neutral. "I was not sure which doorbell to ring in a palace like this." He gave a faint smile. "There are no bells here, only alarms." "That sounds about right," she murmured. He guided her through the space. Everything gleamed: marble floors, steel beams, crystal fixtures. Yet the home felt untouched, like a place where no one really lived. The kitchen was spotless, the library arranged by color rather than title, and the living room was filled with designer furniture that seemed to have never been used. "You can use the guest room on the east side," Elias said. "There is a study next to it if you prefer working late." Clara set her suitcase down and looked at him. "You do not strike me as someone who sleeps much." He paused. "Insomnia is part of the job description." She nodded and walked past him, trailing her fingers along the back of a leather chair. "Do you ever miss the noise of ordinary life?" He frowned slightly. "Noise?" "Yes. The sound of a kettle boiling, a door closing too hard, laughter that does not ask permission." His gaze followed her. "This place was never built for that." "Maybe it should be," she said softly. Later that night, Clara unpacked in her new room. The view overlooked the city lights, stretching all the way to the Bay Bridge. She placed her sketchbook on the nightstand and, almost without thinking, slid the old letter from her father beneath it. It felt safer there, under the paper that held her dreams. She explored the apartment quietly, barefoot, noticing small details. A line of identical shirts in the closet, a row of perfectly arranged books, a bowl of apples, so polished they looked artificial. She stopped in the living room, where a single framed photograph stood on the piano. It showed a much younger Elias shaking hands with his father at the opening of their first hotel. Both men looked proud, confident, and completely unaware of how far that confidence would take them or what it would cost. Elias entered the room behind her. "You found the ghosts," he said. "Just one," she answered, "but he seems familiar." He joined her near the piano. "That was a long time ago, before everything became numbers and headlines. Then maybe you should remember what it was like before," she said gently. He looked at her for a long time, as if trying to decide whether she was being sincere or strategic. Finally, he said, "Dinner is served at 7. You do not have to join me, but it would look strange if we keep eating separately." "I understand," she said. "Appearances must be maintained." At dinner, the table seemed too long for 2 people. A private chef served them in silence and disappeared. The city glittered beyond the windows, but neither of them spoke much. Clara tasted the food and smiled faintly. "It is perfect," she said, "but I prefer street noodles." He raised an eyebrow. "You will not find those near here." "I know. That is what makes them special." For the first time, Elias laughed, not loudly, but real enough for her to notice. The sound surprised him. It felt like something he had not done in years. After dinner, she offered to make tea. The gesture startled him again. No one had ever done that in his home. As the kettle began to hum, she leaned against the counter. "You live surrounded by glass," she said, looking at the windows. "Does it ever scare you?" "Why would it?" "Because glass shows everything, even the things you try to hide." He said nothing. Instead, he watched her pour the tea with steady hands, the steam rising like small ghosts between them. Before she left for her room, she placed a mug on the table in front of him. "For tonight," she said, "so the insomnia feels less lonely." Then she walked away without waiting for his reply. Elias stared at the cup for a long time. The tea was already cooling, but the warmth that gesture left behind stayed longer than it should have. Later, he wandered into his study, restless. On the edge of the desk lay her forgotten sketchbook. He hesitated before opening it, but finally did. The pages were filled with drawings of structures breathing with life: playgrounds, markets, community gardens. On one page, she had written in small handwriting, "Buildings should protect people, not intimidate them." He closed the book quietly, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Then, for reasons he could not explain, he poured the remaining tea into his cup and drank it cold. Outside, the fog rolled in from the bay, wrapping the tower in white silence. Inside, two strangers shared a home built of contracts and caution. But somewhere in that silence, something had shifted. It was not love yet, just a small, almost invisible crack in the wall between them. And sometimes, that is exactly how love begins. Weeks passed quietly inside Mercer Tower. The routine was exact, almost rehearsed. Every morning, Clara joined Elias for breakfast in the glass-walled dining room, where the sun hit the table like a spotlight. They rarely spoke for long, but the silence between them had softened. It was no longer cold, it was cautious, like two musicians tuning before the song began. Outside those walls, however, the world had begun to notice. Newspapers ran headlines about the unexpected marriage between the billionaire developer and the humanitarian architect. Photos from the courthouse appeared online, followed by endless speculation about motives. Some called it a power move, others called it romantic redemption. For Elias, it was noise. For Clara, it was exposure she never wanted. One morning, she entered the office floor of Mercer Group to attend her first executive meeting. The boardroom stretched across half of the building, a cathedral of glass and chrome. Men in tailored suits turned their heads as she walked in. Their smiles were polite, but their eyes were skeptical. Elias sat at the head of the table, calm and precise. "Everyone, this is Dr. Nguyen," he said. "She will be leading the sustainability review for our upcoming coastal development." Someone at the far end of the table muttered, "Convenient timing." Another whispered, "Wife privileges." Clara heard them. She said nothing, just opened her folder and began her presentation. Her voice was even and confident, outlining plans for flood-resistant housing, green roofs, and shared gardens. Within minutes, the room had quieted. Her data was solid, her logic irrefutable. When she finished, even the skeptics nodded. Elias caught her eye. For the first time, he felt a flicker of pride that had nothing to do with business. After the meeting, as the others left, he lingered near the window. "You handled them well," he said. "They were predictable," she replied. "Men who measure value in square footage." "You may have just increased mine," he said, half joking. She smiled faintly. "I was not trying to." Later that week, they attended a charity gala hosted by the city's mayor, a public event where every glance mattered. Clara wore a simple navy dress she had tailored herself. Elias wore his usual black suit. They entered together, arm in arm, a perfectly curated couple under the flash of cameras. "Smile," he whispered. "It sells better than silence." "I thought honesty sold better," she replied softly. "Not in this crowd." Inside the ballroom, chandeliers glimmered like captured stars. A jazz band played near the stage. Guests floated between tables, all perfume and ambition. Elias greeted investors while Clara observed, measuring the architecture of social power. At one point, a well-known developer leaned toward her with a smirk. "Dr. Nguyen, I hear you prefer building homes over profits. How noble! Tell me, how does one monetize virtue?" Clara tilted her head, her smile steady. "By not selling it," she said. The man blinked, unsure how to respond. Elias overheard the exchange and almost laughed. For a man who had spent years in rooms like this, it was refreshing to see someone cut through the performance. Hours later, as the gala ended, the two of them stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the bay. The air was cool, the city glowing below them. Clara leaned on the railing, her hair brushing in the wind. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" she asked quietly. "All the time," he said. "But image is currency. Without it, everything collapses." She turned to face him. "Then maybe you should start building something that does not need pretending." He studied her, the way she spoke with calm conviction, the way the city lights reflected in her eyes. "And what about you?" he asked. "Are you pretending?" She looked away toward the dark water. "Sometimes, but only when I have to." A silence followed, long and fragile. Then she said, "Do you know what your buildings remind me of?" "What?" "Glass cages. Beautiful, expensive, and always empty." Her words stung more than he expected. He was used to criticism, but not from her, not spoken with such quiet certainty. He replied, "And yours?" "Mine are doors," she said. "Even when they close, they invite someone to knock." The wind carried her words into the night. Elias said nothing. For the first time, he wondered if his empire had been built on the wrong foundation, not concrete, but ego. That night, back in the penthouse, he could not sleep. Clara's voice replayed in his mind. Glass cages. He stood in front of the window, watching his reflection overlap with the city skyline. For the first time, he saw what she meant. In her room, Clara sat by the desk, sketching. Her pencil moved quickly, guided by instinct. On the page, she drew two structures, one made of glass, reaching upward. The other, an open courtyard with trees and benches, reaching outward. At the bottom she wrote, "One builds walls, the other builds belonging." She stared at it for a long time before closing the sketchbook. The sound of the wind against the window filled the room. The next morning, when she entered the kitchen, Elias was already there, making coffee. The smell was rich and warm, unexpected in the sterile room. "You made that?" she asked. "I tried. I was awake early." She smiled faintly. "That explains the expression." He handed her a cup. "No alarms this time." "Maybe progress," she said. They stood by the window, sharing the quiet. The city outside buzzed with life, but inside, the air felt different, less staged, more human. Neither of them realized it yet, but the masks they wore had begun to slip. And behind them, two people who had never believed in forever were learning how to look each other in the eyes without pretending. By the time spring arrived, the contract marriage between Elias Mercer and Clara Wynne had become the city's favorite mystery. Social media called them the perfect merger. Magazines praised their elegance, while business tabloids speculated about strategy. Neither of them gave interviews, which only made people hungrier for answers. Inside Mercer Tower, the atmosphere was shifting. The board of directors had begun to question Elias's recent decisions, particularly his choice to place Clara in charge of the company's next major project, The Haven, a coastal housing complex meant to symbolize Mercer Group's rebirth. It was ambitious, ethical, and expensive. Too expensive. At the weekly board meeting, the tension finally surfaced. The conference room felt colder than usual, even with sunlight pouring through the windows. Clara stood at the head of the table beside Elias, presenting the updated budget. "Phase 1 will prioritize sustainable materials," she said clearly. "Recycled steel, local concrete, and solar roofing will reduce long-term maintenance costs by 20%. One director, a gray-haired man named Ralston, leaned back in his chair. "That sounds poetic, Dr. Nguyen, but poetry does not pay dividends. You are turning a profit-driven enterprise into a charity." "Hello." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "If profit is your only measure of value, then perhaps you should reconsider what kind of enterprise this really is." Ralston's mouth tightened. "With all due respect, you are here because you married the chairman, not because of your experience in high-capital ventures." The room fell silent. Elias's pen stopped tapping. For a second, the air felt electric. Clara did not look at her husband. She kept her focus on the numbers. "Experience," she said, "is not measured in the size of one's office. It is measured in the impact of one's work. And if you need proof, come visit the South Wharf projects next week. The people living there will show you what impact looks like." Elias's voice cut through the silence. "Gentlemen, Dr. Nguyen's credentials speak for themselves. If any of you doubt that, you may resign before the next quarter's report." No one moved. The meeting ended 10 minutes later, but the moment stayed in everyone's mind. That evening, as the city lights flickered on, Clara stood by the office window, staring at the skyline. Elias entered quietly behind her. "You did not have to take that tone," he said. "They are still my board." She turned around slowly. "I was not defending myself. I was defending your company's future," he sighed. "You made enemies today." "Then they were never allies," she replied. He studied her, the calm in her posture, the quiet conviction. For the first time, he saw how fragile his empire was and how much stronger she seemed standing in its center. 2 weeks later, the Haven Project hosted its first public showcase, a presentation to investors and press at the city convention hall. The event was grand. Banners, models, 3D projections of coastal neighborhoods surrounded by green parks and solar grids. Elias opened the evening with his usual composed tone. "We build not just structures, but the spaces where lives unfold," he said. "And tonight, I want you to meet the architect of that belief." He gestured toward Clara. Cameras flashed. She stepped forward, her voice calm yet warm. "The Haven is not a monument to wealth. It is proof that architecture can remember humanity. We are not just shaping land, we are shaping hope." Applause followed, but so did a voice from the audience, a man from a rival firm, standing with a smirk. How poetic, Dr. Nguyen. But some of us remember when Mercer Group demolished an entire block to build its first luxury tower. Does your hope include the people you displaced? The room froze. Elias's jaw tightened. Clara paused for a moment, then said softly, "It includes learning from the past, not denying it. The difference between destruction and design is the courage to rebuild differently." The audience stirred. A few people nodded. Others whispered. The rivals smirked again, but said nothing more. After the event, reporters crowded them for photos. One woman called out, "Mr. Mercer, is it true your wife will take over future leadership of the company?" Elias looked at Clara, then back at the cameras. "If the company is wise," he said, "it will follow her lead." That quote would appear in every headline the next morning. Later that night, back in the penthouse, Clara sat on the couch with her shoes off, exhaustion finally catching up. Elias poured her a glass of water and sat across from her. "You did well," he said. "Better than I expected." "That was not a compliment," she said, half smiling. "It was meant to be." A pause lingered between them. Then he said, "You should know, Ralston is calling for a vote of no confidence next month. He wants me out." She looked at him, calm as ever. "Then you will fight it?" "I am not sure yet." "Then let me remind you," she said. "The foundation of any building depends on the ground beneath it. If the ground is weak, rebuild it." Her words hit him harder than any boardroom argument. He nodded slowly. When she stood to leave, he noticed the letter-shaped outline inside her sketchbook as she lifted it from the table. "You keep that with you all the time," he said quietly. "What is it?" "Something my father wrote before he passed away," she said. "I have not had the courage to read it yet." He hesitated, then said, "Maybe it is time." She smiled faintly. "Maybe." When she walked away, Elias remained still. The glass walls around him reflected her departing figure in fragments. He realized how easy it was to hide behind reflections, and how rare it was to meet someone who looked straight through them. Outside, rain began to fall again, gentle at first, then stronger. The sound filled the empty space between them, the same sound that had started everything. And somewhere in that rhythm of rain and silence, the line between contract and connection continued to blur. Days turned into weeks, and the storm around Mercer Group kept building. Inside the glass walls of the company, whispers of betrayal spread like wind. Some executives aligned with Ralston, hoping to push Elias Mercer out. Others stayed quiet, waiting to see who would win. For Elias and Clara, the world outside the penthouse grew sharper, but inside it, something began to soften. One Saturday morning, Clara found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, trying to fix a broken coffee machine. The sight made her pause at the doorway. It was strange to see a man like him struggle with something so ordinary. He noticed her and smiled faintly. "You would think I could manage a machine after running a company." She leaned against the counter. "Machines are honest. They stop working when something is wrong. People just keep pretending." He laughed under his breath. "That might be the truest thing you have said to me." The coffee machine hissed once more and finally gave up. He poured water into a kettle instead. The silence between them felt comfortable now, no longer filled with tension. When they sat by the window with their mugs, the city below looked peaceful. The fog was lifting, and sunlight poured through the glass. For the first time, Elias spoke without the armor of his usual tone. "When I first asked you to marry me, I thought I was saving my company," he said. "Now I am not even sure what I am trying to save." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Maybe yourself." He stared out at the skyline. "And if I am not worth saving? Then rebuild," she said softly. "That is what we do, is it not?" That afternoon, they drove together to the South Wharf construction site, the one Clara had fought so hard to defend. Workers moved through half-finished frameworks. Steel beams glinted under the pale light. Children from nearby families watched from the fences as cranes lifted new walls into place. Clara stepped out of the car and waved to the site foreman. Elias followed, his shoes sinking slightly in the damp soil. It was not the kind of place he visited often. It smelled of dust, sea salt, and real life. "Do you see that?" she said, pointing to the corner of the lot where a small garden was being planted. "That was their idea, not mine. They wanted something beautiful to look at while waiting for their homes." He nodded slowly. "They are building hope while we are still arguing about numbers. That is why I do this," she said. "Because people deserve more than numbers." They walked through the site together. Some workers recognized Elias and greeted him cautiously. He surprised everyone by shaking their hands and asking questions. Clara watched him, noticing how his tone changed, less commanding, more curious. For the first time in years, Elias Mercer felt something he could not buy: belonging. Later that day, as the sun began to set, they sat on a wooden beam near the edge of the lot, overlooking the water. The wind tangled Clara's hair, and she tucked a strand behind her ear. Elias watched her quietly. "You look at this place the way most people look at sunsets," he said. "It is the same thing," she replied. "Both are proof that endings can be beautiful." He turned toward her. "Do you ever wonder why you agreed to this us?" She smiled faintly. "At first, I thought I was buying time. Then I realized I was buying a chance to prove that compassion still has value. And now?" "Now," she said, "I am not sure it was a purchase at all. Maybe it was an exchange." The air between them grew still. The sound of the tide reached the shore, rhythmic and steady. Elias reached out, brushing a speck of dirt from her sleeve, his hand lingering a second too long. She did not move away. "Clara," he said quietly, "I cannot remember the last time I felt this. Honest." "That is because you stopped measuring everything," she said. He looked at her. "Including you?" "Especially me." They sat there as the light dimmed, two silhouettes framed by the orange glow of evening. The simplicity of the moment was enough. No contracts, no cameras, just two people who had started to forget which parts of their story were fake. When they returned to the penthouse, the city was asleep under a sheet of fog. Clara placed her bag on the table and hesitated. "Would you like tea?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, but only if you drink with me." She boiled the water and handed him a cup. They stood by the window again, watching raindrops slide down the glass. The sound was the same as it had been that first night, the quiet rhythm that seemed to follow them. Elias took a slow sip and said, "If I lose everything next month, would you stay?" She turned to him, her voice gentle but firm. "I did not marry your empire, Elias. I married a man trying to find what matters." He smiled, almost to himself. "Then maybe I have already found it." That night, Clara could not sleep. She sat on her bed, the old letter from her father in her hands. The paper had grown thin with time. She traced the faded handwriting with her thumb, but still could not bring herself to open it. Some truths, she thought, needed the right moment. In the next room, Elias stared at the ceiling, replaying her words in his mind. For years, he had believed that control was power, that love was a weakness he could not afford. But now, sitting in the quiet hum of the penthouse, he began to understand that maybe love was not the opposite of power, it was the only thing that made power human. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the bay. Inside, for the first time, both of them felt the faint but steady heartbeat of something real, something fragile enough to fear and strong enough to keep. The night before the board's vote, the city seemed to hold its breath. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets silver with reflections. Elias Mercer sat alone in his study, papers scattered across the desk, none of them holding the answer he wanted. For the first time in his life, the future of his empire depended not on numbers, but on trust, and trust was something he had spent years avoiding. Clara found him there, sleeves rolled up, his tie undone, the exhaustion clear in his eyes. She walked in quietly, holding 2 cups of tea. "You look like a man negotiating with ghosts," she said. "Maybe I am," he replied. "Tomorrow decides everything." "Then rest," she said gently. "Empires are not rebuilt overnight." He took the cup from her, their fingers brushing briefly. The warmth spread faster than the tea itself. "Clara," he said after a moment, "if tomorrow goes wrong, if I lose everything, I need you to know something." She tilted her head. "What is that?" "This marriage was supposed to be a strategy, but somewhere along the way, I stopped acting. I do not know when it happened. Maybe the day you told me glass shows what we try to hide." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes soft but steady. "Elias, you were never good at pretending. That is what made this real for me." For a while, they said nothing. The sound of rain returning against the windows filled the silence. Then, almost hesitantly, Clara reached into her sketchbook and pulled out the old envelope she had been keeping hidden. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. "My father wrote this before he passed away," she said. "I have carried it for years but never opened it. I think maybe it is time." Elias nodded, saying nothing as she unfolded the letter. Her voice shook a little when she began to read. "My dear Clara, if you ever find yourself lost, remember this. The world will tell you that power is control. It is not. Power is the ability to build without fear, to love without shame, and to forgive without pride. If you ever meet someone who helps you remember that, do not let them go. When she finished, her eyes glistened, and the letter slipped slightly in her hands. Elias stood and walked closer, his voice low. Your father sounds like a man who understood everything I forgot. She smiled through her tears. He built houses for people who had nowhere to go. He used to say the walls we build for safety often become the ones that keep us alone. Elias reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. The space between them disappeared as naturally as the distance between a heartbeat and a breath. Clara, he whispered, I do not know what tomorrow brings, but if everything falls apart, I want you to remember meeting you was the only thing that ever made sense. She looked up at him. Then stop talking about falling apart. We will rebuild. Together. For a moment, neither of them moved. The light from the city shimmered through the rain-streaked glass, painting them in gold and silver. Elias touched her cheek gently, and she leaned into his hand as if she had been waiting for that touch her entire life. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the bay, but inside, the quiet between them grew louder than any storm. They stood there until the city lights dimmed, and the rain softened to a whisper. Two people who had signed a contract to survive had finally found the courage to exist without pretending. That night, the walls of the penthouse felt less like glass and more like shelter. And for the first time since the beginning, both of them understood what the letter had meant. Some foundations are not built with stone, but with the simple act of choosing to stay. The next morning came too soon. The board meeting began at 9 sharp in the main conference hall of Mercer Tower. Outside, the sky was gray, a mirror of the tension inside the room. Cameras waited in the lobby, and reporters whispered about rumors of betrayal, of votes, of a company tearing itself apart from within. Elias Mercer sat at the head of the long glass table, his reflection blending into the skyline behind him. Clara sat a few seats away, calm but alert, a silent force in a room full of noise. Ralston began the meeting with a smooth voice and a confident smile. Gentlemen, and Dr. Nguyen, he said, we are gathered to discuss the recent instability in leadership. While we appreciate Mr. Mercer's contributions, it is clear that his distractions have cost this company millions. The words landed like stones. Elias did not flinch, but his jaw tightened. Ralston continued, I move for a vote of no confidence, effective immediately. Before anyone could respond, the doors opened. A young assistant hurried in, holding a folder. Sir, there is something you should see, she said. She handed the folder to Elias. Inside were copies of emails and contracts, documents showing that Ralston had been working with a rival developer to sabotage the Haven project, hoping to buy it once Mercer Group collapsed. The room fell silent. Elias looked up slowly, his voice measured. You accused me of distraction, Ralston, but it seems you were the one too busy counting other people's money. Ralston's face drained of color. That is absurd. Clara stood. No, it is not, she said. These are permits signed under your name. You tried to destroy a project that was meant to rebuild a community. The other board members murmured, exchanging glances. Within minutes, the vote that Ralston had planned turned against him. He was removed from the board, effective immediately. When the meeting ended, Elias walked out with Clara beside him. Reporters shouted questions, flashes of light cutting through the hallway. Mr. Mercer, is it true your wife exposed the corruption? Someone called. Elias stopped for a moment, turned to the crowd, and said simply, she did not expose it, she prevented it. This company stands today because she reminded us what integrity looks like. The quote would travel faster than any headline they had ever had. Hours later, the storm had finally broken. The company survived, bruised but intact. Elias and Clara drove to the South Wharf site again, the place that had started everything. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. Workers were laughing, hammering, shouting over the wind. Elias stood beside Clara, watching the frames rise into the sunlight. You saved more than a project today, he said. I did not save it, she answered. We did. He looked at her, and for a moment, the noise of the site disappeared. You were right, he said quietly. Buildings should protect people, not intimidate them. She smiled. Then maybe we are finally building something worth keeping. A gust of wind carried the scent of rain from the bay, and she turned her face toward it. My father used to say every storm ends when you decide to stop hiding from it. Elias nodded. Then maybe it is time to stop hiding. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the same pen he had used to sign their marriage contract. It gleamed faintly in the sunlight. I kept this, he said, not as a reminder of a deal, but of the day everything began. Clara looked at the pen and then at him. What are you asking, Elias? He smiled softly. I am not asking for 6 more months. I am asking for forever. For a long moment, she said nothing. The wind lifted the corner of her hair, the sunlight catching in her eyes. Then she whispered, Forever only works if we keep rebuilding it. He nodded. Then let us rebuild, every day. And he slid the pen back into his pocket and reached for her hand. Around them, the city hummed with new life. For once, the glass towers did not look cold, they looked alive. As they walked toward the site office, Clara glanced at him and said, You know, there is still one thing I have not done. What is that? I have not written back to my father. Elias smiled. Then maybe we can write that letter together. Huh? They walked on, the noise of hammers and laughter behind them, the sky opening into light. What had begun as a contract was now something entirely different, a promise sealed not by signatures, but by the quiet certainty of 2 people who had finally learned what it meant to build from the heart. A year later, the skyline of San Francisco looked different. The sun caught on new rooftops, on the mirrored panels of completed buildings, and on the soft green curve of the Haven, the project that had almost destroyed Mercer Group but ended up saving it instead. The opening ceremony drew a quiet crowd. There were no cameras, no reporters, only families walking through the open courtyards, children chasing each other between garden benches, and the smell of fresh wood and wet paint. Clara stood near the entrance, her hands clasped together, watching as the first tenants moved in. Elias arrived beside her, wearing a simple white shirt, no tie, no entourage. He looked at her the way he always did now, without defense, without armor. You did it, he said softly. She smiled. No, we did it. Together they walked to the center plaza where a small plaque had been installed beneath the largest tree. The engraving read, Built from the cracks we once feared. Clara brushed her fingers over the words. My father would have liked this, she said. Elias nodded. I think he already does. They stood there for a moment, listening to the sounds of life filling the air. Laughter, music from an open window, the thud of a basketball hitting concrete. It was exactly the kind of noise Clara once said she missed the sound of living, imperfect, ordinary joy. Later, as the evening turned golden, they walked to the edge of the pier overlooking the bay. The tide was low, the wind calm. Clara leaned against the railing, her hair moving with the breeze. Do you ever think about how it started? She asked. Elias smiled. Every day. A storm, a contract, and a woman who refused to stay silent. And now? Now it feels like the storm was the only way to clear the sky. She reached into her bag and pulled out a new envelope. On the front, in her handwriting, were the words, To my father, from the life you helped me build. She handed it to Elias. I wrote it last night. It is not a goodbye. It is a thank you. He took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. Then we will keep it here, he said, placing it in a small wooden box beside the tree. When they looked up, the lights of the Haven glowed softly behind them, a city within a city, real, alive, and human. Elias took her hand. You once told me that glass shows everything we try to hide, he said. Do you still believe that? She smiled. Yes, but now I also believe that it reflects what we choose to become. They stood there as the first stars appeared over the water. The city breathed, the sea whispered, and the rain that once separated them now felt like memory. Their story had begun as an agreement, shaped by fear and necessity. But standing beneath that tree, surrounded by the voices of the people they had built for, it had become something stronger proof that love, like architecture, lasts only when it is built on truth. And somewhere between the light and the tide, Elias Mercer and Clara Nguyen finally understood what forever was meant to feel, like not perfect, but real.